Most presidential elections are based on the party of the current person occupying the White House and whether or not people are happy with the job he's done. This situation has masked some horrendous campaigns in the past. Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to break down the 5 worst campaigns by candidates who won the presidential election. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. All of the elections we're covering in this video were significantly closer than they should have been given how popular or unpopular the sitting president was. Now let's dive in. Number 5. Donald Trump, 2024. The most recent presidential election is certainly one of the greatest political comebacks in history, as Donald Trump became just the second president ever and first since Grover Cleveland way back in 1892 to win back the White House after losing his re-election bid 4 years earlier. But honestly, Trump's success in 2024 had nothing to do with him. Sitting Vice President Kamala Harris was his opponent in the general election, and she was running as an extension of the sitting Democratic president, Joe Biden, whose approval rating had dropped all the way down to 37% the month of the election. Post-COVID inflation, the outbreak of wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and major Democratic Party missteps all made this election inevitable for any Republican. Inflation cost incumbents everywhere in 2024. The UK voted for the Labour Party in a landslide to give them control of government for the first time since 2010. The African National Congress in South Africa lost its majority in parliament for the first time since the end of apartheid. Political parties in Japan, Bangladesh, and India all lost their majorities. But on top of it, in America, the Democratic coalition was splintering over the US's involvement in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza, with Biden backing Ukraine and Israel. The latter issue generated strong discontent among the Democratic base, among which support for Israel has collapsed in recent years, and even funding in Ukraine had a level of unpopularity from the isolationist wing of the party that rose up among young voters in the 2000s due to George W. Bush's handling of the Iraq War. Then there's just the way Harris became the Democratic nominee. Democrats spent 3.5 years insisting Joe Biden wasn't too old to do the job and that he was energetic enough to run for re-election at 82 years old in 2024. They even canceled primaries, leaving everybody but Biden off the ballot in 10 states and not even allowing for uncommitted voters in 7 of those states. But after the primaries ended, Biden had a horrific debate performance against Trump.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Everybody saw Biden wasn't up for another term to do the job, and a month later, he dropped out. The party then chose Harris to be his successor without any open convention, leaving many voters feeling cheated out of the chance to pick their own candidate, and Harris was left to run against Trump with the perception that she didn't even earn the nomination. Then she made the entire election about preserving democracy, ditching her early economic populist messaging when she first got the nomination, despite the fact that it was working, and instead embraced former Republicans like Dick Cheney, who were universally hated. With the phrase country over party, she literally repeated John McCain's country first strategy in 2008. And remember, McCain lost in the biggest landslide of the century to Barack Obama that year. So Harris's decision to repeat it made no sense. The only reason Harris wasn't on our list of the worst campaigns in presidential history, and the video we did there, linked down below, is because it lasted just 107 days and was much more about the arrogance and corruption of the Democratic Party as a whole than it was her. But those missteps, foreign policy issues, and post-COVID inflation should have destroyed her. Oh, and Trump survived an assassination attempt, which obviously should have helped him even more. On election day, he did win 31 states and 312 electoral votes to Harris's 226, while the Republicans held the House and took back the Senate, picking up 4 seats there. Trump became the first Republican to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004, but Bush only won 286 electoral votes that year, and Trump's victory was the largest electoral vote margin for any Republican since George H.W. Bush in 1988. He should have won this race by significantly more, though. Trump's win was smaller than either Barack Obama's or Bill Clinton's wins, and his popular vote win was smaller than the margin that he lost it by against Hillary Clinton in 2016, when he won the election there. It was also smaller than Biden's win in 2020 or Bush's in 2004. This is why his campaign is on here. In spite of the Democrats' issues, Trump nearly sabotaged himself, making the race way closer than it should have been. Just from an organizational standpoint, there was notably no ground game, staff turnover was rapid, and he had no campaign message. Instead, Trump relied solely on his personal bond with supporters, which could have proven costly and would have in most other years. This was not the same campaign as his 2016 win, which was a result of him brilliantly striking a chord with traditional Democratic Rust Belt voters due to his focus on outsourcing and foreign wars. He ran against both and outflanked Hillary Clinton, who had run a horrible campaign then, from the left on those issues, which made up for a lot of the missteps he made in that cycle too. But this time, no central messaging resulted in Trump going wildly off script throughout the campaign. Within a month of his announcement, he called for the termination of the Constitution in December of 2022. A year later, he said he'd be a dictator on his first day in office. At his election rallies, Trump ranted about Hannibal Lecter and at one point the size of legendary golfer Arnold Palmer's anatomy.
He took showers with the other pros. They came out of there, they said, oh my God.
Other gaffes included mixing up Nikki Haley and Nancy Pelosi at a rally, changing his position on abortion from some sort of federal regulation on it to just allowing every state to decide whether they want to do it, and bizarrely sending out a social media post that he hates Taylor Swift. Then there was his one debate with Harris, which even his own supporters or close allies like Joe Rogan and Piers Morgan said he lost after she knocked him off focus by bringing up his crowd sizes while he fell into the traps of not being able to say he has a healthcare plan, not taking a stance on abortion once again, and repeating a debunked story about Haitian immigrants in this country, but defending it because he, quote, saw it on television. Trump was already a wounded candidate due to several states passing abortion bans after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, thanks to the 3 justices he appointed onto the court in his first term, because of unpopularity over the January 6th Capitol riots in 2021, which many people blamed him for, and his insistence that the election was stolen, which didn't land with independents. Rather than stay focused on inflation, he consistently tried to drive home the message that the election of 2020 was rigged. And honestly, it hurt him with voters who wanted to move on from January the 6th, and oftentimes bolstered the Democrats who wanted to focus on nothing but January the 6th. Beyond Biden's performance as president and the behavior of the Democratic Party, much of what helped Trump in 2024 on a personal level was also out of his control, including the attempted assassination we mentioned and the multiple arrests, which ended with him being convicted of an illegal scheme to cover up a payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels in his 2016 campaign, which looked wildly political. But none of that was because of anything his campaign did in 2024. The only reason Trump isn't higher on this list is the impressive nature of his political comeback. He was left for dead after his 2020 loss to Biden, and his ensuing impeachment after leaving office due to January 6th dropped his approval rating to 34% at the end of his first term, the lowest of his entire presidency. Then there was the disappointing midterm election results for his party in 2022, where his hand-picked candidates lost easily winnable Senate races in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Coming back from all that to retake the White House in 2024 was certainly impressive, and he did do a few things right, like making the rounds on the podcast circuit with people like Rogan or Andrew Schultz, while Harris hid from as many interviews as possible. But overall, he won this election in spite of himself, and solely benefited from the well-deserved unpopularity of Biden and the Democratic Party. Number 4, John Adams, 1796. We go from the most recent presidential election to the first ever actually contested election. This one should have been a layup for John Adams, who had served as the nation's first ever vice president under the wildly popular George Washington, the nation's first ever president the previous 8 years. Washington chose not to seek a third term when he could have been king, clearly anointing Adams as his chosen successor, and Adams' ties to him alone were enough to win. In addition to his connections to Washington, Adams' political opponent was Thomas Jefferson, who ran as a strict constitutionalist but wasn't even part of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 because he was spending time in France. Was a French loyalist about to beat a Washington loyalist for the presidency? Well, Jefferson did come close. Adams won the election by 6.5 percentage points in the popular vote, but he only won by 3 electoral votes, 71 to 68. The 3/5 compromise, where slaves would count as 3/5 of a state's population when doing the U.S. Census, which would count towards the number of House seats and electoral votes each state got, despite the slaves themselves not actually being able to vote, certainly helped Jefferson overcome the popular vote disadvantage as he was stronger in the southern states. But Adams also had plenty of missteps. This was the first election with political parties, as Washington was an independent during this time, and members of Congress were defined as either being for or against his administration. Adams was the Federalist nominee, defined by supporting a strong central government, a national bank, policies that favored commerce, and a more pro-British foreign policy against France. Jefferson was the Democratic-Republican nominee, which was more supportive of states' rights, believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and supported the rights of farmers and laborers rather than big business. They preferred to side with the French over the British in foreign affairs. Campaigning wasn't what it is now back then, to be fair. Candidates stayed above the fray and relied on their surrogates and newspapers to make their case. Organization was much more important than personality, and organization nearly cost Adams. The key factor that made this race so unnecessarily close was Adams' inability to undercut the sabotage by fellow Federalist Alexander Hamilton. Adams and the Federalist Party selected U.S. Representative from South Carolina Thomas Pinckney, who had also served as the United States Minister to Great Britain and the Governor of South Carolina, to be his running mate. But Adams wasn't prepared for the fact that this was Hamilton's choice. In those days, before the 12th Amendment, electors cast 2 votes for president, and the runner-up would be vice president. The parties would manipulate the results by having all of their electors vote for the chosen president, but then a few of their electors cast another vote for somebody other than the running mate to make sure he would be VP. Hamilton tried to exploit this by coercing Southern electors who supported Jefferson to cast their vote for Pinckney, who would give him more votes than Adams. Although Adams was shown to be politically malleable, he should have been more so here by being willing to strike some sort of deal with Hamilton to make sure his campaign wouldn't be undercut. He also took the high road when his opposition attacked him as a candidate trying to reinstall the monarchy because of his belief in the expansion of the executive branch. Adams could have countered that messaging by engaging more with pro-Federalist newspapers, but he considered that beneath his dignity as a statesman. They also could have painted the Democratic-Republican Party's mudslinging as a form of factionalism that would undermine the young nation. But he did none of that. All of this is what led to Adams barely holding on in the Electoral College, but he could have easily won by more. He did lose the election to Jefferson 4 years later. Ironically, lack of organization is what almost cost Jefferson in 1800 when he came back and beat Adams with over 60.5% of the popular vote, as the same Electoral College rules existed and an oversight by the Democratic Republicans accidentally led to a tie between Jefferson and his VP running mate, Aaron Burr. Hamilton had to lobby fellow Federalists in Congress to support Jefferson, whom he viewed as much less dangerous than Burr in his mind, since Burr had no principles. Also, the Adams family legacy of ignoring mudslinging attacks by opponents cost Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, when he won the presidency in 1824 despite Andrew Jackson winning a plurality of the popular vote and the Electoral College that year in a 4-way race. Adams only won that one because nobody won an outright majority of the Electoral College, which sent it back to Congress, and Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House and one of the 4 candidates in the race, used his influence in that branch of government to whip up enough votes for Adams, who turned around and named Clay Secretary of State in what became known as the corrupt bargain. Adams wasn't prepared for Jackson's campaign style, but that split was always going to happen because of the expansion of white non-landowners, so we left that winning campaign off this list. Number 3, Jimmy Carter, 1976. Running as an outsider on a platform of good government, Jimmy Carter was the former Democratic governor of Georgia and had a very favorable environment. His opponent, incumbent Gerald Ford, was only in that role because the president and vice president, Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew respectively, both had to resign after 1972 due to separate corruption scandals. Nixon had Watergate, and Agnew, who resigned first, had a bribery scandal dating back to his time as governor of Maryland, and Ford then replaced Agnew. On top of that, there was Ford's unpopular pardon of Nixon, the first ever sustained stagflation in the US under his presidency from 1973 to 1975, and the foreign policy backlash of Saigon when he withdrew from Vietnam. Carter should have won in a landslide, but instead, he only captured 297 electoral votes and won the popular vote by just 2 points. How did Ford keep it so close? Well, if you watch our video on the best campaigns by losing presidential candidates, link down below, you'll see that Ford executed a brilliant strategy of being honest with the American public, and he used the emergence of television to deliver messages directly to the American people from the White House, looking presidential and restoring public trust. He was also brilliant with his use of campaign funds, as that strategy hardly cost any money, and then he used his entire war chest on an ad blitz in the final month that almost led to him winning in an upset. Carter, who was doing the typical cross-country campaigning that became commonplace for Democrats after Harry Truman's win in 1948, was not prepared for Ford's strategy. It opened the door for him to make more gaffes, as campaigning naturally more often than not tires out the candidate. The most notable example of these gaffes was when he did an interview with Playboy and admitted that he had committed lust in his heart. Now, that's just being honest, and it's not admitting to any affair, so it shouldn't upset anybody, but he was going to need the evangelical vote to win this election as a Southern Democratic evangelical himself, and such a comment did hurt him. Presenting himself as an outsider, countering the perceived corruption in Washington, Carter also refused to take a stance on taxes, abortion, or many race-related issues, and Ford was able to hit him on that in the last month. Since Carter was running on his personality as somebody with integrity and who could be trusted, an obvious attempt to tie everybody on the other side to Nixon and Agnew, more honesty about his positions would have been appreciated by the public, and given the improving reputation of Ford, the personality contest strategy turned out to be a mistake. Still, Carter was able to win the White House as Ford had just too much to overcome, but this refusal to stand for anything made Carter unable to keep the Democratic coalition together while he was president, as stagflation returned in his final 2 years, and it set the stage for his blowout loss to Ronald Reagan in 1980 and the start of the Reagan Revolution. Number 2. Zachary Taylor, 1848. Running in the first election after the Mexican-American War, Zachary Taylor's win resulted in the demise of his own party, the Whigs, permanently. Taylor won a 3-way race among candidates looking to succeed James K. Polk, who doubled the size of the country in his 4 years as president. Doing that poured gasoline on the fiery debate over slavery and the inevitable fights over whether or not it should expand into the new territories. Polk was popular, to be fair, as a Democrat too, so Taylor overcame a lot for a Whig to win this race, which would make it seem like he ran a good campaign. However, he benefited from the Democrat splintering. Lewis Cass was the Democratic Party nominee, and can we all agree he's John Goodman's doppelganger? Anyway, Martin Van Buren, who was the Democratic president from 1837 to 1841 as the successor to Andrew Jackson, the party's founder, ran a third-party campaign this time as a Free Soil candidate. Van Buren lost his re-election in 1840 to the first Whig president, William Henry Harrison, and between then and 1848, he joined a small, but growing rank in his party, particularly from northern states like him, who opposed the Manifest Destiny principles of Jacksonian democracy and the expansion of slavery into the new territories, realizing it would break apart the Union. Van Buren taking several Democratic voters with him is what led to Taylor winning the election, but he only captured 47.3% of the popular vote and 163 of the 290 available electoral votes. Cass got the rest of the electoral votes, so it was indeed really close. Why was that the case? Well, with slavery becoming a hot-button topic, Taylor alienated both sides. He was a slaveholder himself, but lost a lot of Southerners by not being clear on what he would do about the Wilmot Proviso, a proposal in Congress to ban slavery in the territories acquired by the U.S. from Mexico. His stated position was to leave the issue of slavery to the settlers in those territories, which angered Northerners, but at the same time, he urged California and New Mexico to apply for statehood immediately, which would have resulted in them likely being free states without Southerners settling there yet, since there had already been a Mexican ban on slavery that was embedded in their populations. Taylor tried to stay out of all of that and, following in the footsteps of Harrison and Jackson, decided to stress his military record, in his case from the Mexican-American War, as the reason for his qualifications to be president. It didn't really work, but it kind of did since he won. It was only because his vice president, who was Millard Fillmore, was significantly more anti-slavery and brought along just enough traditional Whigs. Still, Taylor's win drove out many self-proclaimed conscious Whigs, or anti-slavery Whigs, So under his leadership, the Whig Party ended up standing for nothing, which resulted in them presiding over the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, eventually under Fillmore after Taylor died in office, two disastrous policies that only further sent the country down the path to civil war. After Taylor, no Whig was elected again. Franklin Pierce won a landslide in 1852 against Winfield Scott, who couldn't keep the coalition together, and while James Buchanan was ambiguous on slavery in 1856 as Taylor was in 1848, Buchanan was able to win a three-way race against Fillmore, the Know-Nothing Party candidate, and upstart Republican Party nominee John C. Fremont. There was no Whig by that point, and the lack of clear stance by Buchanan, it's worth noting, also made the war inevitable. Simply put, after Polk, a bold leader was required to address slavery, and every president from then until Abraham Lincoln was a complete coward on the issue. They all dodged the biggest, most hot-button topic of the day, and only won because they were lucky enough to exploit the divisions of the other side's coalition. Before we get to our worst winning campaign, I want to address a couple of honorable mentions. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes won the election of 1876, marking the fifth straight presidential election win by a Republican to that point. He beat Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden with Reconstruction as the major hot-button issue, even though Tilden won the popular vote by 3 points. Hayes had 165 Electoral College votes to Tilden's 184 at first, with 185 needed to win. But Republicans legitimately disputed the election results in 4 states: Oregon, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, claiming fraud and intimidation specifically kept Hayes from winning the 3 southern states. To address this issue, Congress created an electoral commission, which gave all 4 states to Hayes an 185 to 184 electoral college victory. In what became known as the Compromise of 1877, Republicans are speculated to have made a deal with Democrats that if they won the White House, they would pull federal troops out of the South and end Reconstruction. And Hayes did just that, leading to 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow laws. It didn't have to come to that though. Had Hayes and the Republican Party been more prepared for the inevitable voter intimidation by white militia groups in the South at the time, there wouldn't have been any issue. He would have easily won the 3 disputed southern states, plus Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And with Republican Ulysses S. Grant holding the White House, it could have been done. However, that mistake of not more aggressively protecting the voting rights of freedmen in the South lies more with Grant than Hayes, as Hayes was just a candidate, which is why he didn't make this list. William McKinley of 1900 had a great platform to run on for his re-election bid, including the strong economy that pulled the U.S. out of the Panic of 1893 and the country's victory in the Spanish-American War. This created a perceived happy time in the late 1890s that was actually known nostalgically as the gay 90s by the 1920s. But he only beat William Jennings Bryan, who ran against him in 1896, by 6 percentage points while capturing 292 of the necessary 441 electoral college votes. While Bryan ran a brilliant campaign in 1896, almost overcoming the issue of the Panic of 1893 that would have plagued any Democrat since Grover Cleveland was president at the time, in this case, McKinley was at fault for the race being so close. He wasn't prepared for Bryant's utilizing of the populace uniting behind the Democratic Party with his support for breaking up monopolies and free silver while opposing U.S. imperialism. After McKinley's assassination, Teddy Roosevelt became president and realized he had to embrace that wing to keep the Republicans in power, which ushered in the Progressive Era. Still, McKinley won by a significant enough margin to not make this list. And the number 1 worst ever presidential campaign by a winning candidate? Joe Biden. 2020. By far the oldest person to ever run for president at the time and then win, Joe Biden ran on what's now known as the basement campaign to unseat Donald Trump. He limited his campaign stops and public appearances and ran as a statesman, focusing solely on Trump's personality to get him over the hump. And crazy enough, it worked, but not because of Biden. It partly worked because that was the year COVID broke out, so campaign rallies were already going to be limited, but it also worked because of Trump's unpopularity. Trump had a 43% approval rating on the day of the election, and his popularity was sinking. This was during the darkest period of the COVID outbreak, and the US was leading the industrialized world in deaths per capita. Even before COVID began, Trump had already been impeached that previous winter for allegedly threatening in a 2019 phone call to withhold funding for Ukraine unless they investigated Biden's son Hunter's ties to an energy company in that country, Burisma. although he was acquitted for that in the Senate. Trump then received a backlash for calling COVID the Democrats' new hoax in February before the outbreak, and he engaged in a public war of words with the CDC and Dr. Anthony Fauci throughout the summer. And in the fall, it was revealed in a recording by Bob Woodward that he was aware of how dangerous the virus was back in January of that year. Then there was the COVID recession that hit, and although Trump did sign the CARES Act in March to send money to people and businesses to keep them afloat, another round came up in the fall of that year. After the House passed that bill in October, Trump did express support for it, but it stalled in the Senate, and Trump then, despite supporting it, openly told Republican leaders to ditch the efforts so they could focus on confirming Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett to fill the seat left vacant by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was going to be a partisan fight. Regardless of how you feel about that decision, it was very bad for him politically, since the vast majority of the American public was in favor of another round of COVID stimulus money. And that, combined with COVID and the economy, were all working against him. Somehow though, Biden only won 306 electoral votes to Trump's 232, identical to Trump's Electoral College victory 4 years earlier, and Biden won the popular vote by just 4.5 points. To be fair, this was the highest turnout election in 120 years, and Biden received a record 81 million votes. Only 40,000 votes in 3 states, though, kept Trump from taking the win, and Biden needed all of the mail-in votes that were counted after Election Day in many swing states to even win that. Of course, that didn't create any issues in the ensuing months. Anyway, how did Trump make it so close? Well, if you watch my video on the 10 worst campaigns in presidential history, you'll see where I lit into Hillary Clinton in 2016 for focusing on Trump's behavior rather than policy in that race. Again, you can see the link to that video down below. Biden literally used the same playbook and dialed it up to 100 in 2020. Before COVID even hit, Biden was campaigning as the statesman, above the fray and pointing to Trump as a unique problem. He launched his campaign with a video in which the central theme was how Trump didn't properly respond with his language to an alt-right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. Seriously, there was no policy position he hit Trump on. Biden's entire campaign was a return to normalcy. He was basically saying that all the US needed to do was return to the era before Trump was elected and everything would be perfect. Logically though, that was incredibly stupid. If that was the case, then obviously Trump wouldn't have gotten elected in the first place in 2016. But Biden, running on a platform of nothing will fundamentally change when a majority of Americans felt like the economy wasn't working for them, pulled it out. Of course, not fundamentally changing anything cost him and his party 4 years later, as it obviously was going to do, but it was just enough in that election. Let's not ignore the fact that Biden had a few wild campaign gaffes during that election too, starting with the first Democratic primary debate, where he couldn't properly explain his opposition to busing from the 1970s in a standoff with Kamala Harris, and actually made the states' rights argument on it. Then he had this gaffe just a month after that.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
He also got caught telling obvious lies, such as claiming that he got arrested in the 1970s in South Africa while trying to visit Nelson Mandela, and that he marched in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And finally, there was this gem in his interview with the Breakfast Club host Charlemagne the God.
If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Funny enough, that specific interview highlights Biden's unclear messaging on the campaign, specifically with criminal justice, which hit breaking point during that election. 2020 was the year of George Floyd's death and the frustration of police brutality boiling over when it came to the Black Lives Matter protest. Biden openly aligned himself with the protesters and spoke in favor of addressing of those issues, which is fine if you're going to accept that it will cost you with certain voters. The problem with Biden is that at the same time, he refused to back off his record on crime in the Senate, which openly included defending his involvement in the 1994 federal omnibus crime bill that fueled mass incarceration and helped militarize the police. In fact, he ceded all the ground on crime to Trump, who signed the First Step Back to try to undo some of the damages of mass incarceration, while also coming out in favor of crackdowns on BLM protesters. A smarter strategy for Biden would have been to either come out forcefully against the protesters or completely repudiate his congressional record on crime. Doing neither hurt him with both groups, just enough to keep this race close. Because of Biden's poor campaigning, Democrats actually lost 13 seats in the House during the election, just barely holding on to a majority. They did pick up 3 seats in the Senate, getting them to 50 to have a trifecta, but 2 of those were Georgia runoff elections on January the 5th. And if Trump hadn't spent the previous month trying to overturn the results of the election, there's a good chance one or both of those candidates would have lost. In fact, Democrats lost Senate races they were favored to win in North Carolina and Maine, and they lost 2 more that were supposed to be toss-ups but turned into decisive outcomes in Iowa and Montana. Biden himself dramatically underperformed the polling, which was actually more off than it was in 2016 but didn't generate the same headlines since the predicted winner actually won. In short, Biden rode the clear elder statesman wave to an election win without really doing anything and making a ton of gaffes the few times he did do something, proving anybody labeled a Democrat would have won that year. But he governed the way he campaigned, assuring anybody labeled a Republican was going to win in 2024. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Who would you say ran the worst presidential campaign of all time but still won? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.